أجمعين. Inshallah, today we're going to be speaking about human rights and specifically slavery in Islam. So we'll talk about the history of slavery and the Muslim perspective of slavery. And it's important for us to begin by saying just the word slavery or the word slave, when we look at humans being taken as slaves, is something which brings about very clear images, and it has very clear connotations in our minds. There's certain images that appear in our minds when we think of slavery in the world. And one of the most common images is, of course, of the slave trade of the West, of people in chains, people being beaten and whipped, the black slaves of America. So this is predominantly what a person thinks when he thinks of slavery. And this is why, in fact, just using the term slavery wouldn't be the correct term from an Islamic perspective, because even books of fiqh and Islamic books, the word abd is what's used when we speak about the slave of Allah. When we say Abdullah, Abdul Rahman, Abdul Rahim, Ibadullah, okay, the women, Amatullah, the believing men and the believing women of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So even when we look at books of fiqh, and even the Messenger of Allah alayhi salatu wasalam himself, in fact, he told us about the word slave itself. Do not use the word slave. The Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, he warned us from using that specific term, and that's something inshallah we'll mention. But the point being here is that in Islam they use the word riq, which is the term that's used when it comes to a person being quote unquote as the slave or the servant or the raqiq or the riq of Islam from an Islamic perspective when it comes to Islamic civilizations. So how do we understand this term in the first place? What is the modern understanding of the word slavery? If we were to look at the word in a dictionary, what is slavery from an Islamic perspective? Some definitions: a condition of having to work very hard without proper remuneration or appreciation. That's one term, dictionary term for the word slavery. A condition of having to work very hard without proper remuneration or appreciation. If that's the term we're going to be using, then I think all of us are slaves here, to be honest with you. I don't think any of us feel hugely appreciated, and that we work very hard and that we're not given proper remuneration for our work. Another term or definition is a civil relationship whereby one person has absolute power over another and controls his or her life, liberty and fortune. That could also be the employer and employee relationship. That actually happens, where the person is almost like a slave. Another term, another definition: work done in harsh conditions for low pay. Work done in harsh conditions for low pay. So we're looking at these definitions, we can say slavery still exists in the West and in this country. Because if these are the definitions we're going by, then it exists. But this isn't something which Islam itself encourages. It's not something which exists in Islam. And to give you some examples very quickly before we go into it in more detail, you had slaves from an Islamic perspective, raqiq, or this idea of riqa, slavery, or servants, whatever you want to call them, who were actually very, very wealthy. They had their own money, and by looking at them, you wouldn't even think, by the way they looked, the way they dressed, the way they behaved, how others treated them, that they were even, that they were even slaves. So slavery began, of course, a very long time ago. There's records of slavery existing 11,000 more prominent because of poverty or because of land being taken. Judaism, in their scripture, it speaks about slavery and the laws of slavery. They say a person who is in debt can be taken as a slave because he can't pay, and he can only be a slave for 6 years. They say pagan slaves are permanent. The Old Testament speaks about beating slaves. That it's permissible to beat a slave, and there's no penalty if he doesn't die straight away. Meaning, if you beat a servant and you kill him, there's a penalty. But if you beat a servant and he survives from his injuries, then it's okay, there's no penalty, you're not punished. No problem. So you have these kinds of laws in old religions or these old scriptures that are mentioned. And slavery is something which obviously goes through and passes through generations. Traditionally, slavery doesn't seem like it was a racial thing. It never seemed to be a racial thing. That was only something which came later. But then you also have modern types of slavery, as we mentioned. So forced labor, which exists in the world, that's something which happens. Prostitution is a type of slavery, because you're subjecting them and you're forcing them to do things they don't want to do. And of course, it's something humiliating and demeaning. And of course, they just, you're in control of whatever they do, wherever they live, however long they work for, etc. Human trafficking is another type of slavery. You know, you're smuggling in human beings for them to be sold to other people. You're buying and selling people, basically. You're getting them to work, etc. Debt slavery, inmates in prisons. One could argue they're also slaves. Especially in America, for example, you have some prisons where if you are a prisoner in those prisons, that prison may have a deal with a local company where the prisoners will work for that company. You know, digging things, building roads, or textiles, making things, whatever the case may be, and they do it for free. So it's a good deal for the company, or they'll do it for a low price, and the prison makes money. So you're basically using the prisoners as slaves. This is something which happens, by the way. It's something which happens in America. Also, you look at South Korea, and the extent that they go to require or acquire an education, to the extent where they end up living in very, very small rooms and they hardly eat, so that they can get a specific type of education to the detriment of themselves. And it's said that even in India, one student kills themselves every hour because of the stress and the pressure of trying to work, of trying to study. In South Korea, they work and they also study. And they'll end up studying sometimes for 16, 17, 18 hours. There's a documentary I saw about education in South Korea where they literally study in the day and then they study in the evening as well. It's like non-stop, just for the sake of getting a job in the future. Statistics say over 40 million people are in modern slavery across the world. 10 million children are in slavery across the world. 2.1 million people are in slavery in the Americas, North and South America. 1.5 million people are in slavery in developed economies. 16 million slavery victims are exploited in economic activities. Almost 5 million are forced into sexual exploitation. 99% of people trafficked for sexual exploitation are women and girls. But it's interesting how you never hear about these things. So slavery in Islam. What does Islam say about slavery? 4.1 million people in slavery are exploited by governments. $150 billion of illegal profits from forced labor in the private economy, and that's per year. In this country, you had the Modern Slavery Act. Anyone know when this act was established? Basically, it said that slavery needs to stop. Any ideas? Which decade? Which?
1890.
Huh?
1890.
2015. 2000. Anyone heard of this before? 2015. The government enacted the Modern Slavery Act of 2000. You can search this up. I'm not making this up. 2015. I'm glad you said that because it sounds even better now when I say it. 2015 Modern Slavery Act. Why did they establish this act? Because obviously there is a huge problem, and they're trying to stop slavery. Literally, it's called the Modern Slavery Act. Why would you have an act in 2015 called the Modern Slavery Act where you want to stop modern slavery if there wasn't any slavery? So who is the one with the issue? So we'll speak about what Islam says, but again, in this country, over almost 4,000 people had been reported as potential victims in 2016 of the Modern Slavery Act. What do I mean by this? They'll bring people in from other parts of the world. They'll smuggle them in. Immigrants, they say immigrants are coming into this country. They'll smuggle immigrants in. Okay, they'll take the passports, promise them a good life when they come. Maybe they're supporting families back home. They'll bring them from East Asia, Philippines, other places, and then they'll take their passports away. There's documentaries of this. You can watch this online, BBC documentaries. They'll bring them in, take their passports, put them in a small room, 10, 15, 20 people living in a small house. And then in the morning, they'll pick them up, they'll put them in a shop, okay, to do, for example, to do the nail varnishing and all these kinds of things. They'll put them in those shops and they'll work there. And then in the evening, they'll go home, maybe give them one meal or some food, it'll be a food a day, and that's it. And they can't go back, they can't go to the authorities because they're here illegally. They knew they were here illegally, but they thought, they'll be able to get some kind of nationality or passport, whatever the case may be. The point is, they're forced. In September 2017 alone, 9 people were jailed for this Modern Slavery Act of 2015. In September 2017. So this is quite a while back now. I'm not sure of the latest statistics. Not to mention the fact that this isn't something specifically in the West. You also have Muslim countries, wealthy Muslim countries, where there's serious issues with regards to forced labor or extreme labor, or people are not being given their rights as human beings. Lots of developed, well-developed Muslim countries, Gulf states, for example. If you look at what was happening in Qatar, for example, for the World Cup, there was some news coming out of there, Saudi Arabia, other places. And this isn't just specific countries. This is like, generally well-established countries. They have issues with workers and the rights of workers. I lived in Saudi Arabia for 7 years, so it's something which you may have seen when you're living there. Maids, workers living in Muslim countries which are well developed, it's also an issue there. Okay, but it's not something that just because it's taking place in a Muslim country that is encouraged or condoned by Islam. So what does Islam say? What is the Islamic perspective of slavery? The concept of slavery in Islam is completely different. Hajar alayhi salam was a slave. And she is one of the greatest women who ever lived in Islam. In history, not just Islam, in history, human history. She is the founder of the city of Mecca. First person to ever live in Mecca was Hajar alayhi salam. So slavery isn't something from an Islamic perspective which degrades a human being, which is hard for us to understand, especially a non-Muslim. Like, what do you mean? Like, slavery is something which, as far as they're concerned, is something bad and evil. From an Islamic perspective, if you understand the riqqa concept in Islam, it's something which is different. You could have been a slave and you could be the leader of an army. You could be somebody who is very, very wealthy. Slavery or taking slaves was only through war, instances of war. And that's from the Islamic perspective. And today, for example, if there was a war, there are certain rules, regulations that should be followed by all countries. So if, for example, there was a war that took place, if a country was under UN rules and under the law based on the agreements with the United Nations, then certain things would not be permissible anyway, because you're under a specific law, and the Muslims have to abide by their conditions. Al-Muslimun ala shurutihim. Also, the idea of aada, customs. Customs have a role to play when it comes to rules and regulations, even from an Islamic perspective. We've spoken about that before with different types of issues. So the riq, or the ama, or the type of slave from an Islamic perspective. In practice, it's similar in some respects to a person who is under one's guardianship, or a living butler, or a maid, or a nanny, or you could say a servant. So that's the closer understanding of what a slave is from an Islamic perspective. And even then, it's different, because if you went into a house and they had a maid, could you recognize the maid? Would you know who the maid is? How would you know who the maid is? Because of,
Busy up and down.
huh?
She's busy up and
She's
down.
busy up and down. What else? Maybe the way she's
Yes.
dressed, the way people talk to her. Okay, the things she's doing. From an Islamic perspective, the one who is under your guardianship, or the one who is quote unquote a slave, has to be dressed the way that you dress. You have to speak to them the way you speak to everybody else. They have to be provided for financially and given the same food that you have. So if you went into a room, a house from 1,000 years ago, a Muslim household, and they invited you for dinner and you sat down at the table, and there were 5, 6, 7, 8 people on that table, you wouldn't know who is the one who's a slave and who is the one who's the host and who is the one who's a family member. You couldn't tell. Even the person serving the food, you couldn't tell. The person could be the brother, the mother, the sister, the daughter. You couldn't tell because of how they interact. So the level of clothing, food, the standards of living, some scholars even say it should be the same as their owner or even better. Similar to prisoners, prisoners of war in Islam. You give them food that you have or even better. You treat them even better, like as if they're a guest. So this is the understanding from an Islamic perspective. And it's very common during war or post-war scenarios, when there's a war, and then we've spoken about jihad before, when there's a war, for example, who's going to suffer the most? The ones who have lost their fathers, their brothers. And so those people end up resorting to prostitution, theft, crime, to be able to support themselves and support their families. And this is something which is common throughout history, even like in our own era. You look at, for example, what's happening in Muslim countries, the same thing happens. They struggle afterwards. So by making these people a riq or a ama, you're defending and you're protecting those who are vulnerable, while at the same time providing for them, taking care of them, looking after them financially, etc. Treating them as if they're one of your own. And when you do this, you're protecting them from having to resort to things which are haram. The Messenger of Allah ﷺ, he had a slave, his name was Zayd. Ibn Umar radiallahu anhuma, he said, we thought Zayd was Zayd ibn Muhammad. We thought Zayd was actually the Prophet's son. We didn't know he had another name. We assumed he was his son, meaning the Prophet ﷺ would treat him as if he was his own son. And it's a beautiful story if you read about the companion Zayd ibn Haritha radiallahu anh. He said, we thought his name was Zayd ibn Muhammad. And it was only because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, Udu'uhum li'abaihim, call them by their father's names, don't call them by your name. That his name was changed to Zayd ibn Haritha. His father's name was Haritha. And his father, long story, Zayd ibn Haritha basically was somebody who was captured as a child. He's an Arab. He was taken as a slave, him and his family, or him and some other people. And he was eventually in the household of Khadija. And then the Prophet ﷺ was in ownership of him. His family, after 20 years or so, 30 years, they came around over 10 years later. So he's in his maybe 20s. They came to him and they found him after, having lost him for such a long time. They wanted him to come back. Can you imagine, like, your family coming back? He decided to stay with the Prophet ﷺ as a slave instead of going back to his family. So you understand that Islamically, this concept of slavery isn't what we think. Riqa in Islam is a different beast altogether, with different regulations and different conditions, different laws. And because the Prophet ﷺ wanted to reassure his family, he stood up and he freed Zayd there and then. He said, Zayd is a free man. And Zayd still stayed with the Prophet ﷺ. As a free man, he never left. He didn't say, yes, I'm free, I'm not a slave anymore, I can go wherever I want. So again, what does this show us? It shows us the treatment that they were being given was so different, it was so good, that they actually wouldn't even consider leaving. They would just say, it's fine, I'll stay. Circumstances and their conditions were not so bad that they would have to leave and they would go anywhere else. They'd rather stay where they were, which means conditions were good for them. So that's one example. You look at, for example, who became Muslim first. Who did Islam attract first? The poor and the slaves. Famous example of who? Bilal ibn Rabah radiallahu an. You had other companions also of the Messenger of Allah alayhi salatu wasalam, Ammar and his family, Yasir and Sumayya, his father and mother. They were one of the first people to become Muslim. The first two shaheeds in Islam were Yasir and Sumayya radiallahu anhuma. The Prophet ﷺ, he spoke about the person who takes a free man and makes him a slave. He said, I will testify on the day of judgment against a man who captures a free man and sells him into slavery. Meaning it's something which is not permissible. So how does a person become a slave from an Islamic perspective? Through war, through battle. And even then there's a wisdom behind this. Also from an Islamic perspective, death through homicide, or the penalty for homicide, a person accidentally killing somebody, is freeing a slave. To free a slave. Aisha radiallahu anha, during her time, she freed 67 slaves. By the way, in the Quran, as far as I know, every single ayah that speaks about slavery is about freeing slaves or about treating slaves well. There are no ayahs that speak about causing harm to a slave or doing something harmful to a slave. Aisha radiallahu anha freed 67 slaves in her lifetime. Ibn Umar radiallahu anh, he freed 1,000. Abdurrahman bin Auf radiallahu anh, how many did he free? So obviously they never had these slaves, they would purchase them and then free them. How many did Abdurrahman bin Auf free? 30,000. 30,000. So in the Quran, it encourages freeing slaves. It doesn't make slavery from the Islamic framework haram itself. Okay, we'll speak about the wisdoms why. Umar ibn Abdul Aziz radiallahu an, he would have his slaves, and of course, as we mentioned, he would take care of his slaves. His slaves were like part of the household. Some narrations and some scholars, they would even say, when somebody would call their slave a slave, they would say, he's not a slave, don't call him a slave, he's my son, he's become my son. He's my son. Umar ibn Abdul Aziz radiallahu an, or Umar ibn Abdul Aziz rahimahullah, he would free slaves and they were living in his household like as if they were family members, and they would come back crying. They would say, we don't want to leave. Because of the way they were treated and them living comfortably and they were treated well, they wouldn't want to leave. You had scholars of the past, from the greatest scholars of Islam, who were former slaves. From the Tabi'een, nonetheless. You had, for example, one of the greatest students of Ibn Umar. His name was Nafi'. And he was called Nafi' Mawla Ibn Umar. He was a slave of Ibn Umar radiallahu an. Ibn Umar radiallahu an freed him. He was almost like his son. And he would continuously study from Ibn Umar. During slavery, and after he was freed, he stayed with Ibn Umar to study. And he became one of the greatest scholars of Islam. Teaching, people who were quote unquote free, not slaves. Can you imagine like any other society that would have this? We'd have slaves actually teaching and having some kind of role, position, some leadership role in the community where they had authority and influence, something which didn't exist. Because again, our understanding is different based on society. Ibn Abbas, one of his greatest students also, was somebody by the name of Ikrimah. Ikrimah Mawla Ibn Abbas. Mawla means the former slave. That's his title. It was something to be, they were proud of it. They would like to be associated with these great companions. And he was a great scholar in his own right. Imam al-Hasan al-Basri, rahimahullah, was also from a family of slaves. Also from Islam is a group in zakah which you are allowed to give charity to, okay, and those are fir riqab wa fir riqab. Who are those who are fir riqab? These are people who wish to be free. So here's another interesting thing. In Islam, if somebody is a slave and he decides, and this is something which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself mentions in the Quran, Allah says, وَالَّذِينَ يَبْتَغُونَ الْكِتَابِ مِمَّا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُكُم. Those who seek a contract for eventual emancipation, freedom from among what your right hands possess, meaning slaves who wish to be free, that you own. فَكَاتِبُوهُمْ إِنْ عَلِمْتُمْ فِيهِمْ خَيْرًا. Make a contract with them if you know there is within them goodness. Scholars, they said, if a slave wants to be free and requests freedom, the master is supposed to, the owner is supposed to give him freedom. So again, it's not even, it's more like a contract. It's more like an agreement. If the slave says, I want to be free, the owner has to acquiesce, basically. As long as he considers the person to be good, he's not going to end up doing something bad and evil, cause harm in society, then he's required to give him his freedom for a certain price. And if the slave can't afford that price, this is where zakah comes in. Fir riqab. Those who wish to be free, to free a slave, the slave can't afford his own freedom, the government will get involved, the Islamic State will get involved, and they'll pay from zakah money this slave to be free. So again, it's almost like, well, why would somebody want to be a slave? Because our understanding of what a slave is different to what a slave is from an Islamic perspective. That's the whole point. We understand it from a whole different lens. The lens we use and the glasses we wear when we look at the idea of slavery is different to what Islam says with regards to ar-riqa or ar-riq. You have the story of Amr ibn As radiallahu an and his son. And Amr ibn As was the leader of governor of Egypt at the time. His son had a race with a slave, a horse race. The slave won the race and his son whipped him. Just frustrated and embarrassed, he lost to a slave. The slave and his father went to Umar ibn Khattab to complain. Umar ibn Khattab brought Amr ibn As and his son. And he said, whip him just like he whipped you. And the slave took the whip and started whipping his son. And then he was done, he gave the whip back. He said, now take the whip and whip Amr ibn As. The slave said, I have no issue with his father. It was just with the son. He said, if you had done it, I would have let you. Why? Some of us would think this is the justice of Umar ibn Khattab. He's saying you are responsible for your son because you're the father. As a leader, you should be even more strict with your children because people will say his children are living at large, taking advantage. On top of the fact that he was a companion and this is his son. So twofold. Leader, or threefold even, companion, leader, and just a father. So he's saying you should have been even more strict. And then he said, how can you enslave a man that was born free? Meaning he had no connection with this person. Some say he was a former slave. How can you enslave this man, treat him as if he's a slave when he was born free? How can you do this to him? Also, Osama ibn Zayd, we spoke about Zayd, radiallahu anhu, who passed away in the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ. His son became the youngest commander of an army, and this was the first army Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu sent out after the death of the Prophet ﷺ. And he was 16 years old. 16, so he's basically what we would consider a child, and he is the son of a former slave. Where in history have we ever come across somebody who was given that authority and that status in Islam at that age, coming from that kind of background, consistently? You might hear stories here and there, one story here, one story there, of this person who rose the ranks, but that exception proves the rule. You hear one story of somebody who is successful, and even though he was a slave, the reason why it's so famous and so common, so popular in certain other cultures is because it never happens. That's the whole point. In Islam, it's consistently the case. There's nothing unusual about it. We spoke about Bilal radiallahu anhu. Also, the scholars, they would say, learn the Quran from 5 people. One of them was Salim, and he was a slave of Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, one of the great Qurra, Hufaz of the Quran. They say that Umar radiallahu anhu had a slave, and narrations mention that he wished for this slave, former slave, to be the leader of the Muslims. I forgot his name now. But the narrations which mention that he was hoping that he was one of the options to be the leader of the Muslims. This is the status of this individual. The famous hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, in case we still have issues with regards to this concept of riq, or this idea of riqqa in Islam. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, there is no superiority of an Arab over a non-Arab. No, a non-Arab over an Arab. No, of a black man over a white man, or a red man over a black man, or a red man over, depending on the narration, except in terms of taqwa. لا فرق بين عرب وعجم إلا بالتقوى, as Prophet said in the narration. There is no superiority, no difference between an Arab and a non-Arab except by taqwa. This is the standard. So Islam actually comes to make everyone equal. Okay, the slave is just a slave. He's basically like a worker, somebody who works for you. You treat them well, take care of them, they live with you, or they have their own place. You provide for them, they live in a nice place. It's almost like as if he's your son, or he's your brother, or he's your father, or he's your sister, or she's your sister, or your mother, or your daughter. The way that they're taken care of. Also, freeing slaves, as we mentioned, is encouraged in Islam. Somebody who breaks their oath, somebody who breaks a fast intentionally. Other things which happen from the penalties is freeing a slave. It's not something which we need as an institution in order for us to survive. The reason why there was a civil war in America is because the South, they said, if you abolish slavery, we're not going to be able to survive in our economy because we're so dependent upon slavery. But this again wasn't the case when it comes to the Islamic perspective. Why didn't Islam abolish it completely? And scholars mention different reasons. They say because it was something which is, again, number one, the perspective or the idea of slavery is different anyway. It's something which is different anyway. It's not the same as what we assume. Number two, because this idea had been around before the coming of the Prophet ﷺ. And it's something which was very common in the Muslim Ummah, in the early days of Islam, amongst the Arabs. And it was something which was to continue. If it was something which was to be abolished there and then, it would have been problematic. Why would it have been problematic? Because it was something which was very common. Certain things were removed slowly by the wisdom of Allah, such as alcohol, other things. Certain things continued, but all the signs, all the ayat, hadith point to how it was encouraged to free slaves. So there aren't lots of narrations or any narrations which speak about the reward of gathering slave and having slaves, but more about freeing slaves. The majority of Abbasid and Ottoman leaders were children of slaves through their mothers. So the leaders would marry, they would have their women, and they would have children. Those children would become leaders. Children through slavery. You have Ismail and Ishaq. They are children of slaves. Sarah, Hajar, alayhi salam. Slavery was something which eventually was abolished in Muslim lands. So you look at the 19th century when other countries were abolishing slavery, likewise it was the same in Muslim lands. But again, the concept of slavery was different. If it was not done based on what Islam says, then it wouldn't be permissible. If you're beating and causing harm and oppressing people and enslaving them and keeping them in terrible conditions, and you're not doing what you're supposed to do as a Muslim by being just to them and providing for them like you provide for your own family, then of course it wouldn't be something which would be permissible in the first place. Also, you had some of the great Muslim commanders later on who became great, who were from slaves that became well known. You have, for example, Gibraltar, which is named in Arabic. Anyone know what it's called in Arabic? Jabal Tariq. It's called Jabal Tariq, after somebody called Tariq. Tariq was the first one who took an army without the permission of the leader, Muslim leader, by the way. He saw an opportunity. He crossed from Morocco into Spain, and it basically took over Andalusia because they were so fragmented. The Christian kingdoms, they had lots of kingdoms in Spain, Andalusia at the time. So he took over. Tariq ibn Ziyad was a slave, a former slave, and Gibraltar is named after Tariq ibn Ziyad. Jabal Tariq. It's called Jabal Tariq. So again, you look at the Islamic perspective, it's very, very different to what we see. Napoleon, they say, when he arrived in Egypt, he was surprised at how the freed slaves were treated equally. There was a man from the 19th century, a French man, who spoke about what he saw, and he was very surprised. I'm trying to find it now, I can't find it now. He was very surprised at how they were treated and how this wasn't the general understanding of slavery that they had in the West. It was something which was very different. So what are the conditions of this concept of slavery that Islam had in the olden days? Number one, of course, you would treat them the same as you would treat others in terms of food, clothing, etc. The way you would talk to them, treatment of them, the way you would speak to them. They shouldn't be called slave. The master wouldn't be called the master. His wealth that he made would belong to him. So you could have a millionaire slave. You could have a raqiq who was a millionaire. A riq from riqa, somebody from riqa who's a millionaire. Again, it doesn't make sense. It's almost like a contradiction to us. As we said, he can ask also for his own freedom. And we mentioned the ayah regarding this. So again, this was just some words with regards to looking at the Islamic perspective of riqa, having servants, or this idea of slavery from an Islamic perspective, looking at what history says and also the issue of modern slavery. And with that, inshallah, we'll conclude. Any questions?
But in the slaves, what's the nowadays? Slaves, what's the alternative? So like breaking like fasting.
So you would feed 10 poor people, or you would fast 3 days. 3 أشهر 3 months. No. 3 months to feed 10 poor people. جزاكم الله خير. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك.